The following program is part of a college course. These telecourses allow you to earn college credits at home. For more information, contact a college or university near you.
And Zachary, tell me the name of this animal. The pig. Good, Zach. Where will we...
At a very young age, we all strive to group or classify things so we can make sense of the world around us.
I know what this animal is. Good. Does anybody know what sound?
Classification is really important because how we classify as scientists affect how we think. If we think that an animal is a dog, then we immediately think about the properties that make a dog. If we see something like a toy poodle and we say, gee, maybe that's a large rabbit or something, then when it gets sick, we don't know how to treat it. We don't know all of the things that go along with being a dog. And the same thing is true of bacteria, it's true of plants, it's true of everything.
The Greeks made the earliest known attempts to categorize the living world. Then in 1735, the Swedish botanist Carolus Linnaeus published his landmark works that are used as a basis for classification even today.
Linnaeus' contribution to classification was that he wanted to build a system, a natural system, to explain all of life. Part of this system was the existence of a binomial naming system, consisting of two names called genus and species. The genus name is the first one, and you can think of that as being a family name, perhaps like the name Smith. The second name is the species name, and you might think of that as being, say, a given person's name. So there are lots of species within a genus, just as there are lots of Smiths. There's not only Sally Smith, there's Joan Smith and Sam Smith and so forth.
Classification is based on the idea of grouping into organized units. For example, suppose you were trying to identify a particular apartment somewhere in the world, and that apartment represents a species. You would begin the identification process with the largest logical unit, the country which, in the living world, would be analogous to kingdom. In a similar way, the state would be a phylum. County would be class. City would be order. Street would be family. Address number would be genus. And apartment number would be species.
The most popular contemporary classification system divides the living world into 5 kingdoms or countries. Monera, which includes bacteria and all prokaryotes, cells without an organized nucleus. Protista, chiefly single-celled eukaryotic cells, those that contain a nucleus and other membranous organelles. And 3 multicellular kingdoms, plants, fungi, and animals.
Classically, people have used morphological characters to relate organisms. And that works perfectly fine for things like animals, for plants, for even fungi. In that, one looks for common properties. One looks for teeth that are constructed in the same way, for bones that are made the same way. This is fine for most eukaryotes, but for single-celled eukaryotic organisms, there are very few characters to relate organisms. The situation's changed, though, in the last 10 years because we have available DNA evidence. We can sequence DNA from different organisms and we can relate them using their DNA. This is important because many groups that have essentially no information to relate them, like the bacteria, can now be classified for the first time.
Because of these new classification techniques, the order of living things is rapidly changing. This is a dynamic field of inquiry. For the first time, scientists have the potential to group organisms based upon genetic relationships and branches or nodes in inheritance lines, rather than on arbitrary characteristics.
It's important to understand about the lineage and the history of any organism or group of organisms. How it came to be, what were the environmental conditions, the general ecology. It's amazing that a certain amount of convergent evolution occurs. Porpoises look like fish, for example, but they don't look like fish when you look at their nucleic acids or their internal cellular apparatus. They look like mammals.
So molecular techniques are confirming some groupings, changing others. And at the kingdom level, there have been some surprises.
The amount of change that has occurred recently, if it were extrapolated backwards in time, says that plants and animals and fungi last had a common ancestor about 1 billion years ago. The fungi and the animals a little bit more recent. We would put it at about 950. The plants then branching off just before that at about 1 billion.
The fact that the artificially derived 5 kingdoms are not totally independent of each other, but are in fact branches of a common tree of life, is an idea that fits well with the ancestry or node-based classifying scheme. While the 5-kingdom system helps us classify the world around us, it's a system that's likely to change over time.
And I think what we're trying to do is understand as individuals how we fit on the earth. Everybody's interested in genealogy. People like to know who their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents are. But in a larger sense, I think we also like to know how we're related to the rest of life.
Well, we don't actually know how old these guys are.
As scientists develop new tools, new methods, perhaps even whole new systems with which to classify the vast diversity of life, their understanding of our world will continue to evolve. And in this effort to better determine the origins of all organisms, the greatest change will likely be seen in the smallest places. This gourmet offering looks enticing, and there's even more to it than meets the eye. In fact, there are microorganisms just about everywhere, not just in the food we eat, but in the air we breathe and on the objects we touch.
Food is always contaminated, but if you eat it quickly and you don't leave it sitting out so that these toxins can be produced and that bacteria can multiply, it's usually not a problem. Only about 1% of the bacteria that's all around us causes disease. And all of the rest of it is good. In fact, we do use it in food production to make Swiss cheese. That's what makes the holes. Yogurt, absolutely. And there's an acidophilus milk that they put bacteria in.
We live with bacteria every day, in our bodies, on our bodies, in the food we eat. There are several thousand different species which by their sheer number challenge scientists' ability to order and classify. DNA studies have just begun to help us reorganize these diverse organisms. So, for practical reasons, they are still grouped by more classical means, such as where they live or what they need in their environment to survive. Public health officials are often required to identify specific bacteria.
Typically, you look at physical and biochemical properties. There are a series of tests that will separate out major classes, and then you do more and more specific testing until you identify a specific genus or species.
Kingdom Monera's thousands of species are so diverse that they are actually grouped into two subkingdoms. Archaebacteria includes organisms that live mainly where nothing else can, where temperatures are too high, salt is too concentrated, or oxygen is too low. The other subkingdom, Eubacteria, is more familiar and includes some autotrophs like blue-green algae, also known as photosynthetic cyanobacteria. However, most eubacteria are heterotrophs that depend on organisms like us for energy and may cause disease in the process. Each species has a characteristic look when grown on media. Colony features like size, shape, and edge characteristics help with the identification. But with so many species, more distinguishing characteristics are necessary to tell one from another.
One type of test is the gram stain that you can do on a clinical specimen, and then you can begin to base your antibiotic treatment on what you think is the most likely cause.
A gram stain colors the cell wall of some bacteria, but not others. The presence of a dark purple color is gram-positive. Its absence is gram-negative. This test is important because the differences in the cell wall it identifies also makes the groups respond differently to antibiotics and aids doctors in selecting medication. Other identifying features include cell shape, cocci, rods, or spirochetes, or the presence of flagella, spores, or capsules. Most definitive, however, is the different media requirements needed for the organism to grow in culture. This is often the only way to identify Salmonella, a potentially disease-causing bacteria. Often it's important from a public health perspective to know not just what disease a person's suffering from, but why and how they got that disease. Answering these questions makes it possible to do more than simply treat a disease. It makes it possible to prevent others from getting that disease.
I can't overemphasize the importance of keeping hands clean. The other thing that I think is critical in addition to hand washing is temperature control. Keeping foods really cold or really hot.
Temperature is critical because most disease-causing bacteria can only reproduce at moderate temperatures. In a process called binary fission, the bacterium's single circular chromosome replicates itself. Each resulting copy attaches to the cell membrane. As the cell grows, adding membrane and wall components between the two attachment points, the chromosomes move apart and eventually form two cells. Under optimal conditions, doubling time is less than 20 minutes, depending on the species. At this rate, one bacterium can become 1 million in less than 7 hours.
I get asked often, well, aren't you afraid to eat out? No, I'm not. You can't create an environment where you're not going to be exposed to infectious organisms. And you don't want to do that because then you will be susceptible to everything. There isn't much in life that is risk-free, and we do what we can to minimize it.
How you doing, sir?
Hi.
What can I get for you?
Can I have 2 boneless
In
chicken
food,
breasts?
bacteria causes most health risks. But there are other non-cellular agents called viruses that might inadvertently be served in a meal. viruses such as hepatitis. Viruses are so unique they are not classified in the 5 kingdoms at all.
The problem with viruses, of course, is that you can't cure them with antibiotics. Antibiotics work with bacteria. You kind of have to let them run their course with viruses. It's a different problem.
There's a 20, and a 40.
For antibiotics to work, a virus would have to be truly alive. It would have to be able to reproduce on its own. And it would have to have a bacterium-like metabolism for the antibiotics to attack. But a virus is much too simple for that.
The simplest virus has only 2 components. It has protein and it has nucleic acid. The protein basically makes a shell or some sort of a container, a helical container or a spherical container. And inside that container we find the nucleic acid, which may be RNA, ribonucleic acid, or DNA. And that is the genetic material of the virus. Now by itself, that virus cannot reproduce. It must borrow on the enzymatic and the reproductive mechanisms of other organisms. And that's why viruses always infect some host.
The virus attaches to the host cell and injects its genetic material, leaving the protein coat outside. The DNA or RNA overtakes the host cell and forces it to make new virus particles. The host cell finally ruptures, releasing new viral particles to attack more host cells.
Once they infect the host, then they can use the host's enzymatic machinery to reproduce its own nucleic acid and to reproduce its own protein. And that's why it has to always infect and borrow from another organism.
Scientists think viruses are so diverse because they probably had several different origins from different cell fragments.
A virus can stay in food even though it can't grow and develop, and it has to get into a warm body, be it a flea or a rat or a human, in order to grow and reproduce and cause damage.
One of the things, obviously, that we're all concerned about is pathological viruses which produce things like colds and hoof and mouth disease and AIDS and other diseases of this nature. Obviously, controlling those viruses and finding therapeutics and ways of attacking those viruses is extremely important to all of us. It's a matter of survival.
Until scientists find answers to these fundamental questions, the best protection we have against illness, whether from bacterial, viral, or other sources, remains prevention.
It's really quite amazing that when you sit down and think about it, if people would cover their mouth when they cough and sneeze, wash their hands after using the bathroom and before preparing food, it would eliminate quite a bit of the transmission of many infectious diseases. That's a message that doesn't excite people, and it's a message that we never seem to be completely successful in getting across.
Our world is populated by a whole host of organisms that we can't see. A drop of seawater may seem crystal clear, yet it contains hundreds of living plants and animals. When these organisms proliferate beyond normal levels, ecologists like Dr. Peter Franks set sail to observe the brew known as a red tide.
A red tide is a massive accumulation of single-celled algae. These algae contain pigments just like plants on land. And when you get them in very high concentrations, they actually color the water just the way a plant leaf is colored green.
In the case of a red tide, the algae dyes the ocean a rusty red color and can be toxic to sea life and to humans. This is why Dr. Franks attempts to understand the ecology of these tiny organisms.
I study how the plants interact with their environment in the ocean. So I need to know about the physics of the ocean and the chemistry of the ocean, since these plants grow using nutrients and light just like terrestrial plants.
These algae are part of the diverse kingdom of primarily single-celled eukaryotes known as protists. Many protists, like plants, are autotrophic and can synthesize energy from sunlight. Others, like animals, are heterotrophic. They are chiefly grazers or predators that ingest nutrients from fellow organisms in the surrounding environment. Still others are more fungus-like, in that they absorb nutrients rather than ingest them. Then there are those with both plant and animal characteristics that defy attempts to logically classify them.
Phytoplankton are microscopic plants, and the zooplankton are microscopic animals that float around in the sea. The word planktos is a Greek word which means wanderer, and that's basically what these plants and animals do. They're just wafted around by the currents in the ocean.
For the animal-like protists, sometimes called protozoa, further classification is loosely based upon how they move within their environment. Some, such as the amorphous amoeba, flow at an excruciatingly sluggish pace. Others, like either flagellated or ciliated protozoa, scamper quite freely through the water. The defining feature required for protists to be considered plant-like is the pigment chlorophyll. Not surprisingly, protists with both animal and plant characteristics, like euglena or dinoflagellates, both move and have chlorophyll. Other single-celled algae, such as diatoms, are a bit less mobile. They are further defined by their cell wall characteristics. Finally, there are the multicellular algae, protists grouped by color: red, brown, and green. Unlike most protists, they have more than one cell. However, these algae are still considered protists because their cells are not specialized into tissues. Dr. Franks is especially interested in phytoplankton, the protists upon which all other sea life depends.
The different types of organisms tend to be found in different types of environments. For instance, in very calm conditions with low nutrients, we tend to find flagellated phytoplankton. They can swim down into the nutrient-rich waters and exploit that nutrient source. In the coastal regions, where we have a sloping bottom topography, tidal currents, and waves, we have a lot of turbulence, and that allows the growth of diatoms, these organisms that would tend to sink out if the water was very calm.
Protists are the most basic eukaryotic organisms, distinguished by a nucleus containing genetic material, and by specialized membrane-bound organelles including mitochondria for ATP production and chloroplasts for photosynthesis. Scientists believe that these organisms originated from bacteria through a process known as endosymbiosis, a process in which one species resides inside the body of another.
I think the endosymbiotic theory is one of the great success stories of molecular biology. At some stage, this cell engulfed a prokaryotic bacterium. The net result was that it maybe bit off more than it could chew because this bacterium found it could survive within the eukaryotic cell. Not only could it survive, but it also, in the case of the chloroplast and mitochondrion, probably gave some benefits to the eukaryotic cell. For example, the mitochondrion let eukaryotes metabolize oxygen. The chloroplast let plants utilize light to make a living. So clearly this was a major invention. In recent years, there's been even more thought that maybe the nucleus and the formation of the eukaryotic cell also was the original endosymbiotic event.
All manner of organisms have evolved from that original eukaryotic cell. When Dr. Franks looks at a red tide, he is first concerned about identifying the type of plankton responsible.
Red tides can be toxic, and the toxicity is determined by the organism causing the red tides. Along the coasts of Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, starting around May of every year, they have outbreaks of paralytic shellfish poisoning. This poisoning is caused by a toxin contained in a dinoflagellate called Alexandrium tamarense. Luckily, along those coasts, they have excellent monitoring programs, and so the shellfish are very safe to eat.
Most plankton, of course, aren't harmful. In fact, plankton are essential to life in the sea.
Phytoplankton form the base of the food chain in the ocean. They're like the grass of the ocean, the wheat fields of the ocean. So any of the tuna that you love to eat, or the mackerel that you eat, any sushi bar relies on phytoplankton.
By collecting data on the conditions and patterns of phytoplankton growth, Dr. Franks is opening the door to a new expanse of knowledge.
There's so much that we don't understand about the phytoplankton that makes it a wide open field. Most of the really interesting ecological questions left on this planet are in the ocean, and it makes it a very exciting field to study.
Although microscopic, Protistans comprise an important part of the tree of life, the part that connects simple bacteria to multicellular organisms. Because of their unique position, Protistans may hold the key to a better understanding of more complex organisms like fungi, plants, animals, even Homo sapiens, the human species.